Welcome to 24 Hours Past, 20 Years of Past Learnings and Future Visions. We're excited you can join us today for Catherine Wilhelmsen's session, Pipelines and Packages, Introduction to Azure Data Factory. These 24 Hours of Past consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by experts and speakers from the past community. The session will be recorded and posted online after the event. You will receive an email letting you know when these are available. My name is Juliana Greco, and I'll be the moderator of this session. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Catherine. If you require technical assistance, please type your request into the questions pane located on the right side of your screen, and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Please feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the question and answer portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session, which will pop up after the webinar ends in your web browser. Your feedback is really important to us for future events, so please take a moment to complete it, please. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Microsoft and Intel. The station of 24 Hours of Past wouldn't be possible without their generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. If you would like to learn more about Microsoft or Intel and sign up for information on how they can help you, please visit the sponsors page on the 24 Hours of Past website. Keep learning all year long with PASS. Visit PASS.org and check out all the free educational resources available to PASS members. Also, don't forget that PASS Summit 2019 will be happening on November 5 in Seattle, Washington. Head over to PassSummit.com and register today. This 24 Hours of Past session is presented by Catherine Wilhelmsen. Catherine loves teaching and sharing knowledge and is based in Norway. She works as a senior business intelligence consultant in Menta, focusing on data warehousing, data integration, analytics, and reporting projects. Her core skills are Azure Data Factory, SSIS, BIML, and T-SQL development, but she enjoys everything from programming to data visualization. Outside of work, she is active in the SQL Server community as a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, BIML Hero Certified Expert, author, speaker, blogger, organizer, and chronic volunteer. Okay, perfect. And without further ado, here is Catherine with Pipelines and Packages, Introduction to Azure Data Factory.
Thank you so much, Juliana, for that lovely introduction. And welcome everyone to my session here at 24 Hours of Past. This edition has a theme called Past Learnings and Future Visions, and that ties in perfectly with my job these days, and maybe also your job. So my history didn't start 20 years ago when PASS was started. Mine started about 10 years ago when I started working with SSIS, or SQL Server Integration Services. That was one of the first products that I started learning, and one of the first products that I feel like I truly loved because it was fun working with it, and I've loved data integration ever since. SSIS looks something like this. It's a visual interface. It's easy to get started with and easy to use for beginners like I was 10 years ago. And this is a typical control flow where you can execute different tasks, you can do chaining and branching, and it also has a functionality for creating data flows where you can do transformations inline inside your SSIS packages. Now, a few years ago, we got something new. So we got something that was kind of branded as SSIS in the cloud. That was Azure Data Factory version 1. Azure Data Factory version 1 looked something like this. So you can see it looks kind of similar to SSIS. It has some of that same interface that actually wasn't there when they released it, but it came after a little while. But it was never really SSIS in the cloud. It did not have the same features, and it was kind of a misbranding back then. This was more for orchestration, data movement, and it was very limited in terms of features. So if you're starting with Azure Data Factory today, don't start with Azure Data Factory v1. Today, if you want to get started with something, start with Azure Data Factory v2. This is much more like SSIS in the cloud. In some ways, it's way better than SSIS, really. It has a lot of native cloud integrations and connections that you can use that you won't get in SSIS. So Azure Data Factory v2 looks more something like this. Now, as you can see, if you compare that to the previous SSIS screenshot, it's very similar in some ways. You have the same kind of chaining and branching. You can do different branches on success or on failure. You have all of these different activities that you can do. But if you are like me, if you started out with SSIS, you may have a whole lot of questions. How do you move from SSIS to ADF? Are all your SSIS skills irrelevant now? Should you start with just ADF? Do you have to start all over again? And what about that SSIS solution that you've spent years building? Should you stop using it entirely? There are so many questions that I had when I started moving over from SSIS to ADF. So what I tried to look at here is it possible to take what I learned in the past about SSIS and apply it to future ADF projects? And to kind of answer those questions, we don't have a whole lot of time here today. I could probably talk about this for hours and days, but we only have about 45 minutes for the content here today, so I'm going to try and focus on the most important things. And we're going to start with a little introduction of Azure Data Factory. What is it and what can you do in it? So Azure Data Factory is a hybrid data integration service where you can create complex and scalable pipelines for all your ET and ELT workflows. And you don't have to write any code. You can do this all in the visual interface in your web browser. And similarly to SSIS, it's very easy to get started and start using Azure Data Factory. The main component of Azure Data Factory are your pipelines. This is the core of Azure Data Factory, and everything is built around these data pipelines. Now, to work with these pipelines, you do need to work with a few different components of Azure Data Factory. The first one are all your different activities. Now, these are the actual tasks that you're running inside the pipelines, the tasks that you can chain and branch and control. You also have something called data flows, which we will cover a little later in the session. Now, this is still a preview feature as I'm recording the session here today, so you have to apply to get access to it right now. If you are watching the recording, this might be available now. The data flows, very cool feature. We'll look at that a little later. Now, you also need to work with different data sets. Inside your pipelines, you want to connect to different sources. So if you have a table or a file, all of those are represented by data sets. So these data sets just represent the data that you're working with. And to connect to those data sets, you need to define some linked services. These are similar to the connection managers that you have in SSIS. Now, outside of the pipelines as well, you have a couple of other different things that we'll look at. The first one, which is a very recent feature in ADF v2, is something called templates. So you can create pipeline templates. So you don't have to start entirely from scratch. You can start with a predefined template and work out of that. When you have your pipelines, you can also trigger them. So there are a couple of different triggers. You can choose to trigger them immediately and start executing them, or you can do them on a schedule or an event. For example, if a file lands in some kind of storage. And finally, you also do need to think about different integration runtimes. And this is something that we'll look at a little more when we get to the SSIS part of the session. So instead of talking about this in the slides, let's just move over to the Azure Data Factory UI and walk through it and kind of look at what it looks like, how it works, and what you can actually do in there. So I am going to switch over to my browser here. And this is after you've created an Azure Data Factory and you open it up, you get to this page that looks something like this. Now, the Azure Data Factory team has done a fantastic job of creating all of these tutorials and videos for you, all different guides. And In the session here today, again, we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but I do want to show you this because you can start looking into this for your own continued learning. So on this page, you can see that you have some quick starts up here to create a pipeline. You can create a pipeline from a template. You can copy data, and you can also configure SSIS integration. There are a whole lot of videos down here that you can also look at if you're interested in learning more about a specific activity. For example here, how to rerun activities or how to do data transformation at scale. You can also scroll over here to see more of these videos. And then finally, if you prefer reading, they also have a whole lot of tutorials that you can click on and get through to from the Azure Data Factory interface. And finally, all the way at the bottom here, more learning, more resources, and the latest updates. So if you are brand new to Azure Data Factory, make sure that you go through this page and look at all the different resources that you may have. Now on the left side, you'll see this little menu over here. We can choose to expand this and get details about what we're actually looking at. So the page I'm on right now is the Data Factory overview. If I switch over to the author view, you will see a slightly different interface. And this is going to be your main interface when you're working with Azure Data Factory. So this is where you want to build your pipelines and do all the different things that you have. So on the left side here, you can see all your different factory resources, things like my pipelines, my data sets, data flows, templates, and all the way down at the bottom here, you can define your connections and your triggers. You can also choose to collapse this if you're working on something. All the way at the top here, something to point out, you can also connect your Azure Data Factory to Azure DevOps or GitHub for Git integration. And this is something that I've done right now. I've connected it to my Git account, and I've created a specific branch that I'm using for development. Now, source controlling, branching, and team development is outside of the scope of this session, but this is just a best practice that I want to call out specifically for one reason. If you are working inside of Git and you're working in a branch, it allows you to save your work in progress. If you're not connected to Git, you can't actually save something. So if you're in the middle of developing something and it's not completely done, you can't just save that work temporarily with errors. You need to make sure that everything validates before you publish it. So once you get started with Azure Data Factory, take some time to set up the Git account because the save all or save button is going to save you. Trust me on that one. So let's take a look at some of these pipelines that I have. And I'm not going to start entirely from scratch here, but what you could do if you wanted to do that, you can click on this plus sign and you can create different pipelines or pipeline from templates. So I just want to show you this template thingy first, just to show you the different options that you have in here. So what you can see are some of the most common scenarios that probably Microsoft sees at their customer sites. So things like bulk copy from database. If you know that that's your use case, you can click on this one and you can see this template here. It has a lookup followed by a for each loop. And all you have to do here is define the different data sets that you want to work with. If you don't have any data sets, you can also create new ones from this interface. And this is a very nice way to get you started with Azure Data Factory. Now, if you don't want to start from a template, you can also create a blank pipeline. And that's going to show you this interface here where you can see all the different activities that we can work with. You get the save feature here again and a couple of different options. And this blank space right here is going to be your primary interface for working with your pipelines. So if we expand all of these activities here, you can see all the different things that we can do inside of a pipeline right now. So things like copy data, that's probably the most common one. Recent addition is that you can actually delete your source files. And if we scroll down here, a whole lot of other things like execute pipeline, execute SSIS package, and so on. And just a quick note here, the Azure Data Factory team is very good at releasing new features. So this validation and webhook activity was just released a week ago as we're recording this. So make sure that you stay up to date on the news there as well to make sure that you don't miss out on anything. So if you know what you're doing, all you have to do is drag something onto the interface And then down here in this pane at the bottom is where you configure that activity. So what I've done here now is I dragged a copy data activity onto the interface, and I can click through the tabs down here to configure it. On the general page, things like name, description, and then in a copy activity, I have to specify my source and my sink. My sink is my destination. So everything that you do in these little tabs down here in the settings pane. Otherwise, for the pipeline itself, you build it up here. So I can also do things like chaining and branching. For example, if I've copied some data and I want to delete a source file, I can just click and drag, and these are connected. And if you don't like the layout of this, there's also this handy little button down here called Auto Align that's going to sort things out for you. If you have a very large pipeline, you can also click on Zoom to Fit, which in my case is going to zoom in because I only have 2 tasks. If you have a whole lot of tasks, you can zoom out as well, or you can reset the zoom level. So it's very easy to work with once you get started. Just start clicking, dragging, dropping, and see what happens. So I'm going to go out of this here now, discard my changes, and show you an actual example that I'm going to be using for my demos today. So inside of my pipeline here, you can see that I have a couple of different folders. You can choose to create these folders here to organize your different pipelines and your data sets. Now, how you structure it and the naming standard that you choose is entirely up to you. The only thing I recommend is that you have a naming standard. Whatever you choose, I don't really mind. I don't have any recommendations as long as it's working for you, but have a standard. That's my recommendation. So I sort things into folders just because it's a little easier to navigate for me. So if I start looking at this first one here, you can see that I've defined a few different pipelines. So if I open up this first one here, this is called Lego Load Colors. Now my copy data activity here is very simple. All I want to do is copy data from my blob storage into my Azure SQL database. And I'm going to briefly switch over to Azure Storage Explorer to show you my source files. So if I switch over to Azure Storage Explorer here, you can see that I have all my different source files. So they're very simple CSV files, colors, inventories, parts, sets, and so on. All this is tied to Lego blocks. I do love building Lego. So these are my source files, and I want to copy the data into my Azure SQL database. So if I switch from Azure Storage Explorer over to my SQL Server Management Studio, you can see that I've already set up my environment here, my destination tables. So I have one table for each of my source files, colors, inventories, and so on. And as of right now, if I execute this query here with the select counts, you can see that I don't have any data in here yet. So that's what I want to do in my Azure Data Factory. I want to load these tables. So switching back, let's take a look at the copy data activity itself and just go through some of the basic properties. Now, again, since this is an introduction session, this is the thing that I want to focus on because this is the core of what you want to do in Azure Data Factory. So inside of the copy data, you can see that I've just named it colors, blob to ASQL. This gives me a visual clue of what I want to do in here without having to go and look at the actual source and sink. So that's a naming standard that you can choose to pick up or not. Inside my source, you can see that I have already defined my source data sets. So I have my Lego colors data set, and I can click on this edit button here to look at the predefined one. If I didn't have a data set already created, I could click on new here. You can also see that I can preview the data. So if I click on that one, it's actually going in and reading my CSV file. So I can quickly see what kind of data I have in here. If I look at this data set, I can click on edit. It's going to open this new tab up here for me. You can also see which data set I've opened up here in the factory resources pane. In here, I have to define a connection. And again, I've already created my linked service. So let's just quickly navigate into that as well by clicking on the edit button right here. And this has been set up connecting to my blob account with my storage key and so on. So all of these things are predefined here for this demo, but I could also choose to create a new linked service in here if I wanted to. I can also look at that by clicking on the connections pane down here. And this is going to show me my current link services. I only have 2 in this case, but just to give you an example of all the possibilities you can do in Azure Data Factory, if I click on new in here, you'll see I think there's currently over 80 different link services that you can connect to. And you can filter on these as well. So in Azure, I can connect to things like blob storage, data lake Gen 1 and Gen 2, Azure database for MariaDB, for MySQL, for PostgreSQL, and so on and so on. If that's not enough, I can connect to all of these other different databases, to different files and file storage systems. And if I scroll over here, I can even connect directly to a bunch of services like Dynamics 365 and Jira and so on. So there are so many options inside of Azure Data Factory that you kind of have to go through and look at this, because there's no way I can cover this in an introduction session. So just to give you an example here, go and look at this and see how you can use this to create cool data pipelines for your use case. All right, let's just close out of this and loop to where I started here, which was inside of my data set. So in here is where I've specified my data set. You can see that I'm pointing to the directory and the file, and then I have just specified the different file format down here. Now you can also choose to detect the text format automatically, so you don't have to think about this. And again, you can go in and preview the data to see that it looks the way you expect it to. Now, once I have my data set defined, I am going to close out this and go back into my pipeline again and show you the sync option. So inside the sync, I'm just pointing to my Azure SQL database, and we have the same thing here. I'm connecting to a data set that is connected to a linked service. I'm not going to go through that whole loop once again, but you can see from the little icon here that this is an Azure SQL database. I'm also using a naming standard for my own sanity, so it's easy to see that I'm connecting to the right resource. What you can see in here is that I've also added this little pre-copy script where I specify truncate table and the name of the table. This just ensures that I can run this pipeline over and over again without having to worry about duplicate data and so on. And that's pretty much all there is to a very basic pipeline with a basic copy activity. Now, once I have all of this set up, I can go in and I can choose to either debug it or trigger it. So if I click on debug up here, you can see that it's deploying to the debug environment and it's currently running. And I can see all the output and the status down here. Again, let me just close out this so we can see the whole thing. So under output, you can see that it's currently in progress. And I can click on the little actions down here to see, for example, the input. So in the input here, I can see things like it's running the truncate table pre-copy script. And then once it has succeeded, I can also the output. So I can see how much data was read, written, how many files I read, how many rows I read, and so on. In addition to that, I can also click on the little glasses down here to see the details of this debug run. So again, it's very visual, it's very easy to get used to learning this as well. You can see that I'm copying data from blob storage into my Azure SQL database. I can see the number of rows read, data written, the throughput, start time, duration, and so on. So everything that I need during development is right here on screen for me to look at. So if I go back out of this, I can also choose to trigger now. And this was a question that I had when I started this. What's the difference between debug and trigger? First time I run this, I thought that debug was just testing and validating and making sure that it ran. But something to be aware of is that debug, it's everything. So if you have a delete task in there, it's going to go ahead and delete that file. If you truncate a table, it's going to go and truncate that table. So just make sure that if you're doing something and you're debugging, don't run it directly in production unless that's exactly what you want to do. Now with the debug, you get the output down here. When you trigger it, if I click on trigger now, it's going to say using last published configuration, and I've already published this pipeline, so that's okay. I can click on finish, and now it's running. But now I can't see it in the output pane again. Now what I can do is I can switch over to this third tab here called monitor, and that's going to show me the pipeline runs that have been triggered. So debugging only shows me the output in the pipeline itself during development. Triggering logs it and shows it in the monitoring view as well. So this is now going logged, so everyone who has access to this data factory can see when it was triggered and how it actually worked. So I can see that my pipeline was, it started, well, right now, 10 seconds ago, and it finished, it succeeded. And I can also go in here and click on View Activity Runs to see some of that same view that we had in the output. Down here, the same actions. I can click on the eyeglasses to see the throughput, the rows read and written, and so on. So it's very easy to kind of navigate inside of Azure Data Factory. You just need to spend a little bit of time to get used to the interface. Switching back to Author here, this was a very basic, simple example. So if I'm closing out this, what you can see here is that I have all of these different pipelines. I can also choose to orchestrate them. So instead of running all of these different pipelines, I can do one of these orchestration packages and just choose to execute all of them. So again, if I click on Trigger Now and Finish, it's going to start running that entire package, running all of the individual pipelines that I have. Switching back to monitoring, now you can see that all of these different pipelines are currently in progress and they're running. So now they're all going in, reading each of their own files and loading it into my Azure SQL database. And in here, you can see that they're currently in progress. You can also see things like triggered by. So down here on the first package, it says manual trigger, and on the orchestration package, it also says manual trigger. But then the orchestration package is what actually executes all of these other pipelines. So if I refresh this, we'll see that some of these have succeeded, some of them are still running. So this is where we can just keep refreshing, or we can choose to look at some of the other options here. Maybe I want to see the executions for the last week, the last 30 days. Maybe I want to filter on a specific pipeline. So maybe I just want to see this one pipeline down here, or I can clear out of that filter. All of these different things that you can do from this monitoring pane, giving you a very visual view of the status of your Azure Data Factory. So if I hit refresh now, this one is still in progress. So if we go into that, we can see that it's currently working. I can click on the eyeglasses again. It's read 580,000 rows, but it's only written 330,000. So we probably have to wait a few more seconds for this one to finish. If I click on refresh, yeah, it's still working. So let's just close out of this and quickly switch back into my SQL Server Management Studio. And if I execute this query here with accounts, again, just to make sure that we've actually loaded this data, we can now see that we have rows in our database. So the final pipeline is still running, but it's working. Yay! Switching back into the author, I'm just going to quickly close out of this and hop back into my slide deck here. So that was a very brief introduction to Azure Data Factory, looking at how you can create pipelines, how you can specify a copy activity. There are so many more things that you can do in Azure Data Factory. Again, go and look at those videos, look at those tutorials, and go at other videos that people have created around Azure Data Factory. In this session, though, like I mentioned at the start, I started out with SSIS, and I've spent years learning SSIS. I've spent years learning it, and I've also built up a skill around BIML, Business Intelligence Markup Language, for automating and scripting the development of my SSIS package. So I have years invested into a technology. What am I supposed to do in here? Am I supposed to just redo everything? Do I have to create all of my pipelines from scratch again? And fortunately, the answer to that is no, you don't have to do that. You can also lift and shift your SSIS packages into Azure Data Factory. So why would you want to do that? Well, first of all, this is the same thing with any kind of use case where you might want to move from a legacy solution premises and move into the cloud. You may want to do it because you want to reduce maintenance and letting Microsoft take care of all the patching and servers and so on, or you want to reduce your costs. You want to just move away from all of that infrastructure and hardware that you currently have and shift it into the cloud instead. You can also use this to start modernizing your solution while retaining your investment. So my use case here is with all the knowledge that I have around SSIS and BIML, my existing solutions, I don't want to scrap all of that. But I can lift and shift it into Azure by using Azure Data Factory and kind of start moving away from SSIS and more into ADF and start building up a hybrid solution. And one of the great things about this is that you can continue to use the familiar tools and processes that you have. So I can continue to use SQL Server Management Studio. I can continue to use Visual Studio and SQL Server data tools to develop my SSIS packages. And I can also continue to use BIML. The only difference is that I'm deploying to Azure instead of to my on-premises SQL Server. So the way you do this, if you have an existing solution, it's not very complex, but there are quite a lot of details that you have to dig into here. So I'm just going to give you a very quick overview, and then I'm going to hand it over to you so you can go and look at the details here. First of all, you do need an Azure SQL Server that will host your SSIS DB, your SSIS catalog. This is where you want to deploy your packages into. Once you have that, you need to configure your SSIS integration runtime from Azure Data Factory, setting it up, and that's, we'll get back to this in just a second. Then once everything has been set up, the change for developers is that instead of deploying to on-premises SQL Server, you deploy it now to your Azure SQL DB, to the SSIS DB catalog. And then you can use Azure Data Factory to orchestrate your SSIS packages. So the integration runtime that I mentioned in the second step on the previous slide, this is just a managed cluster of VMs that's dedicated to running SSIS. So this is just your engine. You have to spin up your engine. And one of the common questions that I get with people who want to move from SSIS to ADF and lift and shift their solutions is, but I have third-party components or I use some specific processes. Can I still do that if I lift and shift into Azure? And the answer is yes. You have to do that when you set up your integration runtime. So you can customize that setup. And then when you spin up this managed cluster of VMs, it can install components for you, or it can start Windows services, or any kind of thing that you would normally do in your on-premises environment. So it's fully flexible and it can do pretty much anything that you can do in your on-premises environment. And you can also get access to all your on-premises data by joining to a virtual network. Now, I'm not going to go into details on any of this. This is out of scope for this session. But if you have an existing SSIS solution and you're doing some more advanced stuff than just loading from blob storage into a SQL Server, Azure SQL database, take a look at Sandy Winarco's session from SQLBits. This was just a month ago. This video is available for free, and he's working on the program team building this SSIS feature in Azure Data Factory. He goes into all the details that you need to get up and running on this. For now, though, I just want to show you the very basics of how this works inside of Azure Data Factory. So I am going to this time switch over to my Visual Studio environment, just to show you my existing SSIS solution. And what you can see in here, this is pretty much the same solution that I started building out in Azure Data Factory, except now I have everything in my SSIS packages. So I have my loading packages over on the right side in the project, and I have the same kind of orchestration package running all of the other packages. And it's very simple. It does the same thing that I showed how to do in ADF. It truncates the destination table, and then it loads from blob source to my SQL database destination. So it's doing exactly the same thing, except I'm doing it in SSIS. So once I have this, I can just right-click and deploy that into my Azure SQL database, which I've set up already. So I'm not going to do that here. Instead, I'm going to switch over to SQL Server Management Studio. And inside of this integration services catalogs, you can see I have my SSIS DB, and you can see that I've deployed my project. So this is exactly the same if you've deployed your projects to on-premises SQL Server. It looks exactly the same and it works the same. So you can set up things like your different environments, you can configure that, and you get the same type of logging. You're just deploying it to the cloud instead of on-premises. So all of this has been done already, so I'm not going to go into details here, but switching back into my Azure Data Factory, you can now see that I can execute these packages from my pipelines. So in here, I have two different options. My first package here, what you can see is that this is just executing all the different SSIS packages that I have deployed. So this pipeline here is the same as the orchestration package that I had previously. So this is just kind of rebuilding a package that I already have. And this is just to show you how this works. Again, if you're starting from scratch, you can just click on this execute SSIS package, drag it onto the interface, and then you can go through and configure that. Let me just hide this for now so we get a little more screen estate. But for now, I've already done this to save some time. So looking at the options for this. So the first one for executing the colors package, if I click on settings, and I'll expand this as well. You can now see that I've already pre-configured my Azure SSIS integration runtime. So I've selected that one. And then I can go in here and navigate to the folder, the project, the package. I can specify which environment I want to use and the logging level. Or, and here's a very important part, down here, I can also click on this manual entries. And if you ever need information in Azure Data Factory, you're not sure what it is, just hover over this little eye icon here, and it's going to give you a description of what that is. Now, what this one says is, this requires you're running Azure SSIS integration runtime. And to navigate and refresh in the way that I'm doing, I need to have my SSIS integration runtime up and running, and that's going to cost money. So if you don't want to do that, I have a slide on that in just a second. If you don't want to do that, you can click on this manual and just type it out. In that case, you're not running the integration runtime and it's saving you just a little bit of money in here. But for now, we're fine. In here, I can also choose to specify my SSIS parameters. So this is already mapped up for me because I'm using SSIS environments. But in here, if I didn't have that set up, I can also choose to connect to my Azure Key Vault and get all my passwords and secrets from there. But this is very similar to what you might see from SQL Server Agent and so on with the connection managers. So this is one way that you could do that. Same thing as previously. You on debug, you can click on trigger, and that's just going to go in and actually execute it. When you execute it in through Azure Data Factory, if you trigger it, you'll get two types of loggings. So the first one is by triggering it. Again, you can go into the monitoring view and look at the execution of the pipeline itself, but you can also look at all the standard reports in your SQL Server Management Studio. So if I click on reports and I click on all executions, again, I don't want you to sit here and look at things spinning for too long, so I've already executed this earlier today. So what you can see here is that all of these fortunately succeeded, and I can go in here and look at the overview, messages, performance, and all the standard logging that I had for SSIS. So I get this logging in here that we're familiar with, and then also the logging in Azure Data Factory. So that was very quick introduction to SSIS in Azure Data Factory. Now I could also go ahead and run this, but I don't want to spend time on that right now. So I'm just going to navigate out of that and hop back into my slide deck. Short summary of what I just showed you. If you're working with SSIS right now, you just deploy it to your Azure SQL database, you spin up your integration runtime, and then you can execute it in there. So the one thing that I mentioned here, and this is also important for you to be aware of, is that when you spin up your SSIS integration runtime in Azure Data Factory, it's going to bill you as long as it's running. So a key lesson here that I learned is only start this and only run this when necessary, meaning when you actually need to deploy, execute your SSIS packages. Otherwise, it's just spinning there, doing nothing, and costing you money, and you don't want to do that. I've heard a few stories of people who forgot to turn this off and ended up with kind of higher bill than they expected. So one thing to note though is it takes a little bit of time for this integration runtime to actually start. It takes, well, Microsoft says 20 to 30 minutes. I've experienced everything from 10 to 30 minutes. So it does take some time to spin up, and the reason for that is that it's actually deploying this cluster of VMs hosting your SSIS engine. So it does take some time, but one thing to note is that Azure Data Factory has one of the templates that you can start with that has this predefined task where it spins up the integration runtime, then executes your packages, and then shuts it down afterwards. So this is just a lesson learned that I want you to take away. If you're working with SSIs in Azure Data Factory, make sure that you turn it off when you don't need it anymore. Otherwise, you might get some bill. And this is the same as for all Azure services. If it's running, it's going to cost you money. So looking at ADF versus SSIS, they're very similar in many ways. In SSIS, they're called pipelines, linked services, and sinks, while in SSIS, there are packages, connection managers, and destination. And I'm pretty sure even in this session here, I've called pipelines packages because that's kind of what I'm used to. They're similar though in many ways. But then the one thing that we haven't really covered yet is the data flow capability. Now, data flows is very cool, but it's still in preview. So what you're seeing here is a preview feature. I'm hoping that is going to be released shortly, but I have no idea when they're actually going to do that. But I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of that today. So mapping data flows allows you to do data transformation at scale. So what we've seen so far is just copying data from a blob into Azure SQL database. Not really exciting. You could do that in many other ways. With data flows though, you can do all of these different transformations with joins and aggregations and all sorts of things that you might be familiar with from SSIS. And all of this runs on Azure Databricks behind the scenes, so it's highly scalable. And everything is done in the visual editor. Again, you don't have to write any code to get this working. So if you're familiar with SSIS, if you're familiar with the visual interface, then this might be for you. And it can look something like this. So on the left side, you have your sources, and then you can do different things. You can see joins on there, you can see aggregations, and then on the right side, you can see the different sinks that we have. So this is a very guided experience. It guides you from left to right, from source to sink, and you can do all sorts of fun things in here. If you want to look into more of the details of all the things that you can do, I want to point you to this resource here by my friend Camille. He spent a lot of time building out this ADF to SSIS to SQL Server mapping cheat sheet containing all the activities, the SSIS equivalents, SQL Server equivalents, and he's keeping this updated as well. So if you're ever stuck or you're wondering what something is, go ahead and look at this cheat sheet. So instead of just showing you a random data flow, I want you to see an actual use case where this is 100 times better than SSIS, in my opinion. So what you can do with mapping data flows is you can actually handle schema drift. And schema drift is where you have changing source files or changing metadata. If you add or remove columns, if you rename column names, changing data types, and so on. And if this isn't handled properly, schema drift can and most likely will cause problems for you. If you've worked with SSIS, I'm sure we've all seen this dreaded error here, needs new metadata. That means that you have to go in and change all your packages, update them, redeploy them, and rerun them, even if you just add or change a column in your source file. In Azure Data Factory, on the same copy data, you can get a similar error message. So it doesn't handle it out of the box for you. So in this case here, you can see a user error, invalid column name, column comment does not exist in the table. So here we have a mismatch between the source file and the destination, meaning that it doesn't handle it out of the box, but we can handle it with mapping data flows. But you have to go in and actually make sure that you want to handle this, because this isn't something that everyone has to deal with. So let's take a look at one example of this. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go into my source file here, into my storage account, and I'm going to rename one of my original files from colors, original, and I'm going to add a new column. So what I'm doing here, I'm changing my source file, and I'm going to break it on purpose. So you can see that my original file was 3.6 kilobytes, and my new file is slightly larger because it has an additional column in here. And I want to show you how we can handle that by using a mapping data flow. So switching back into my Azure Data Factory, I'm going to go down here to my data flows. And the first thing that I want to show you is how to handle this by using schema drift. So what you can see in here is the same thing as I showed you in the screenshot. And just to show you very quickly, you can click on this plus sign here to see all of these different transformations that you can use. But for now, I just want to use a very specific example here on schema drift. So I've already set this up. So I have my colors source here. And the key thing to notice is down in the options, I've checked for this allow schema drift. Now this just makes sure that if I get 5 columns or 10 columns or whatever, it's going to handle that automatically for me. So inside of here, you can see, oh, sorry, did not mean to click that. My source data set, if I click on edit connection, just make sure that I preview the data. What you can see in here is that I have this new column in here called Hi 24 Hop. It's a comment in here. So this is new compared to the previous table, the previous file that we had. So in here, what I need to do to handle schema drift. Now this looks kind of complex right here, but I'll walk you through this very quickly. In here, in the transformed columns, this is a derived column. What I'm doing here is I'm working with data column patterns instead of specific columns. So in here, I've specified that each column that matches, and then I have a very simple expression where the column name equals ID. I want to use that original column name defined by the $$ That's the expression language in mapping data flows. And I want the value of that to be 2 integer $$. So that's the original value. This might not make a whole lot of sense right now. So let me switch over to my SQL Server Management Studio just to show you very quickly what it looks functionally. There we go. So in my original Lego colors table, you can see that all of my files here were nvarchar 255. They were simple strings. So what I want to do inside of my data flow is I want to make sure that I can handle schema drift, but I also want to make sure that my IDs are integers and my is transparent column is actually a Boolean instead of an nvarchar. So that is what I'm doing in here. And finally, I'm just loading that into a new table. And I don't want to break anything, so I'm loading it into a brand new table here. You can see that in the setting as well. There is one option here called Recreate Table. And this is pretty cool because this not only does it handle schema drift, but it also handles creating the destination table for me, so I don't have to set up all of that before I create my data flow. So to actually debug this, to run this, we have to add this data flow in a pipeline. So I've already done that up here. So let's just go ahead and trigger now. And I'm going to click on finish, and it's going to start running. This again allows me to switch over to my monitoring view. We can see now that it's currently in progress. I can click on this monitoring, and we can even go in and take a look at kind of the execution plan. We can see what's going on in here. Now, all of this is doing is grabbing that new file, handling it, and recreating the destination table. So let's see if this works. If I switch back into my SQL Server Management Studio, and on my tables, if I click on refresh, oh, no, it's still working. Let's just make sure that we don't have any errors in here. Let's see if it's still running. So sometimes this might be a little bit slow. I'll switch back, try again. And it's still not showing up. Ooh, I might have a little demo failure here, but let's leave this running for a little bit longer and I'll just switch back into my pipeline. So we can see that it did succeed previously. Hopefully, I'm crossing my fingers here. Hopefully it will do that again. If not, I will have to just skip this demo. Let's see. Nope, we might have a demo failure here today, but I'll leave that running for a little bit longer to see if it finishes up. What it should have shown you is that we should have a brand new table, and that table should include the columns with the right data types, plus the additional comment column that we added. But let's just leave that for now. Let's leave it running for a little bit longer, and I'll show you the second data flow that I've set up. So the second data flow in here, this also handles schema drift, but it does one additional thing. So in here, again, it's getting all of that data for me. I'm doing the transformations on the columns that I have, but in this case, instead of using the original column name, I want to rename it into something that's a little more user-friendly. So I'm renaming ID into color ID, name into color name, RGB into RGB color, and ISTrans into ISTransparent. And again, I'm also making sure that I'm casting the types into the right data types for me for when I create that destination table. This also handles schema drift, but I only want the 4 columns. So in here, in my select column, what I've done in here is, I can actually show you. If I click on auto mapping, you will see that I have all of these original columns coming through, and then my new columns. But I don't want to do auto mapping, so I've specifically chosen to only keep these 4 columns that I've specified. And this allows me to create that destination table with only 4 columns, even if I get 5 or 10 or 50 columns in my source file. So this, again, is something that is very powerful inside of the mapping data flows. Just want to go ahead and look at the monitoring here very quickly. Oh, you know what? Let's cancel this one. It's been running for 3.5 minutes, so that is not working. So what you can see in here now, it's showing canceled. I'm just going to go ahead and try and debug this one instead. So this new one here, let's try and debug. Let's see, this one. Let's see if it's working if I debug it instead of actually deploying it. It might be that when I'm triggering it and running it, it has to spin up this data flow source previously. Up here, you can see that I've already specified my data flow debug environment. So let's just try this and cross my fingers that this is going to work instead. So we can see that it's currently running. I'm going to switch back into SQL Server Management Studio. Refresh. Nope, you know what? I might be very unlucky in this demo here today with something inside of my data flow debug cluster environment here. So it's been up and running for a little bit, but in preparing for the session, there may have been some timeouts in there. So what should have happened is that I should have had a brand new table in here with the columns that I defined. And this is kind of a cool demo, so I'm a little bit bummed that it didn't work. I'll try just one more time here and see if it's working. Nope, not today. So what I have to do here is I have to rerun this demo, post a blog about it with the videos showing what should actually have happened, and then you can come back and look at that instead. But we are running out of time here, so I'll quickly switch back into my slides and wrap up the session for today. I do apologize for that. So some final lessons learned here today is that everything in ADF has a price. And this is very important because this can also change how you as a developer work with both ADF and SSIS. So what was considered SSIS best practices might not translate into Azure Data Factory best practices. And with that, I mean that if you have a lot of SSIS packages running a ton of activities, and maybe you're doing a lot of retries, or you have a package that's just running constantly checking for something, that means that you're going to pay for that if you deploy it directly into ADF. So make sure that you consider the patterns that you have and optimize for performance. And again, if you're working with SSIS, make sure that you turn off that integration runtime once you're done with it. And finally, when working with this, things are moving so rapidly that you have to learn how to learn and adapt. This is kind of the key point here. Suddenly, you might have a new activity show up in Azure Data Factory that can improve previous pipelines that you've created. This just happened to us in one of our projects. So there are a few things here, some key takeaways for you. So I do apologize again for that demo. I am going to make sure that I run it, record it, and repost it on my blog alongside with any questions that I might not have time to answer in the last few minutes here today. So you can go in and look at what that was supposed to look like. And outside of that, I wish you luck. Like you can see, it doesn't always work the way you want it to. So good luck to you. But I hope that this could be interesting to you. And I hope that you can see some potential use cases for Azure Data Factory or even SSIS if you have. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Juliana and see if we have any questions.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. And the first one is, how do we schedule pipelines within ADF?
So to schedule pipelines within ADF, you create triggers. I'm going to quickly switch over here and show you this triggers pane. If I click on new, you can see that I have a new trigger of type schedule, and that allows you to specify things recurrence, if you want to do daily, weekly, monthly, or so on. So I can specify that I want to run it daily, or maybe I only want to run it on specific days. Once you've created that trigger, you can attach a pipeline to it, and then that's going to be run on that schedule that you specify.
Perfect. A second question is there any limitation on ADF in terms of volume, like large tables or?
No, so that's a great question. ADF is built for handling big data, so it is completely scalable. The limitations that you have is, what kind of sources and destinations are you working with? If they have some limitations, then obviously it's going to take longer to load if you're working with smaller Azure SQL databases, for example. Or if you're running through SSIS, when you set up the integration runtime, you can also choose to scale up or down that integration runtime to handle the amounts of data. So that's one of the great things about ADF is it's completely scalable and it's built for handling high volumes and all sorts of different data, really.
Perfect. And we have one last question, and is, oops, let's see if I can get it. Yeah. How to handle multiple environments in ADF with avoiding to recreate pipelines?
So if I understand that question, it's specifically around environments like dev, test, and production without having to recreate pipelines. Now, the optimal solution for that is that you have your dev environment that's connected to your Git account. So you publish everything into your Git account, and then you can set up continuous integration or do it manually, where you deploy from your Git account using ARM templates into your test and production. So you can set up all of that automatically. And this is, I think that's more, I don't think we have time to go through that in detail, but that's how I would do it. I would work with this in my dev environment, publish that into my Git repository, and then have an automated process for deploying that into test and production using ARM templates. So a lot of keywords there that you can go in and dig into.
Perfect. I see that there is people that is still sending their questions, so we are already over the time. Is there any way that they can contact you?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to skip over the slide. So right here on the screen is my email, hi@catherinew.net. Just note that there's no E in the middle of my name. That's the funny Scandinavian spelling. Any questions that we didn't get to, I'm going to summarize all of those in a blog post after the session, along with hopefully videos of a demo. And then any other questions that you didn't have time to ask here, send me an email and I'll get back to you.
Perfect. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. That was awesome. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so coming up next, we have another presentation, a look into the past and the future of availability and infrastructure for SQL Server deployments with Alan Hurt. So stay tuned for that next session, and thanks everybody again for coming.